My name is Kale Veron, a third-class civilian pilot, hauling cargo between star systems. I'm not the important kind. Not a hero. Not part of any grand mission. Just someone surviving contract to contract, flight to flight, a human from Earth drifting through a galaxy where our species still plays catch-up. I don't have permission to step foot on sacred worlds. I don't have the right to touch ancient civilizations. And yet, that day, I stood before the largest ceremonial nexus of the planet Veltharin, a world not created to live, but built for one purpose alone, to preserve divine bloodlines by mating with the so-called genetic sovereign, the supreme being of their species. They had hired me to transport containers of live enzymes, what they called sacred blood, from the Arkwall belt to the biogate of the central sanctum. No one warned me that I would be the one to trigger chaos across an entire civilization. I simply followed the contract, stuck to the route, did what they told me. But the moment I crossed into the restricted zone, called the core of life bond, I knew something had changed. Not the pressure or the temperature, but something deeper in my instincts whispering that this place wasn't meant for my kind. The tower where the ritual was to take place rose from the earth like an enormous spinal column, fused from living biosubstance, gently pulsing as if it breathed. A soft violet light shimmered from millions of enzyme crystals embedded in its walls, tinting everything in distorted dream hues. At the center, encased in a translucent sheath of living tissue, stood the being they called Xenomate X9. But that name was unworthy of her. I had never seen anything so beautiful, so unreal. She stood tall, slim, impossibly delicate, and yet every curve of her frame carried an unspeakable biological power. Her skin radiated a soft silver glow, not reflecting ambient light, but pulsing with an inner rhythm of her own private biocycle, independent of the planet's life systems. Her eyes didn't reflect light. They reflected space. When I looked into them, I saw nebulae I had flown past, stars I'd left behind. And the wings, if you could call them that. Not meant for flight, but for diffusing and controlling pheromones at the cellular level. They were thin, translucent, constantly fluttering in gentle pulses, creating frequencies I couldn't hear but could feel beneath my skin, causing my heart to skip, my breath to stumble. She didn't look at me. She wasn't supposed to. She had been encoded at the zygote level, programmed to only respond to a single type of enzyme, the genetic signature of the sovereign. A being with no face, no name, just the pure convergence of millions of years of genetic refinement and purification. Every cell in her body had been trained to ignore all other life forms, including me. But she looked. The moment I stepped into the transmission radius, she lifted her head, slowly, as if compelled by a subconscious ripple through her neural pathways. I froze, confused, unsure of what I had triggered. Biological data streams scanned across her body, and suddenly everything went haywire. Her enzyme readings fluctuated. Her pheromone emissions broke pattern. Alarm lights flickered from cool blue to biohazard violet. The temple priests panicked, rushing toward the central control array. I was captured almost instantly. No time to run. No accusations needed. Tendrils of living tissue shot from the floor, coiled around my limbs, lifted me into the air like a dangerous contaminant to be neutralized. I felt a chill crawl beneath every pore, not from cold, but from the sensation of being analyzed, stripped down cell by cell. They brought me to what resembled a biological tribunal, though there were no judges. Only clusters of glowing neural masses exchanging pulses of communication. And her, Zira, emerged from behind a curtain of retracting enzyme membranes. No one stopped her. No one dared touch her. She was still Xenomate X9, the sacred vessel worshipped as the sole source of her species' survival. She looked at me. Straight into my eyes. As if the entire world outside had collapsed, and only one question mattered: who are you? You, what are you to her? A deep voice resonated from the wall's biocore. I couldn't answer. I hadn't even spoken to her once. There has been a cellular-level enzyme deviation, the voice continued. Her genetic system is synchronizing with yours. This is an anomaly without precedent. Zira stepped onto the biofloor. Each step triggered shifts in the structure beneath, light channels parting around her like ripples through liquid crystal. She wasn't afraid. She didn't tremble. But in her eyes, I saw something that wasn't supposed to exist: choice. "What is your name?" she asked me, her voice so gentle, no one would have believed it came from a being engineered solely for divine mating rituals. I answered, not from memory, but from the most human place within me, Kale. The moment that name left my lips, she bowed her head. Slowly. Deliberately. Before a panicking council, before thousands of biosensors tracking every enzyme in her system, Zira knelt. And she said, "If I have erred, then let my entire species err with me." From the moment Zira knelt before me, the world around us seemed to distort. The ancient enzyme pillars, structures that had stood undisturbed for millennia, began to tremble, releasing low, guttural sounds like the groans of the planet's own spine. The sky darkened into a deep violet before bleeding into a bio-red, the highest state of alert encoded in Veltharin's collective neural system. In a world programmed through living biology, every shudder of its architecture had meaning. Veltharin was in pain. And I was the cause. A mortal. Not a god. Not a chosen being. Just a random intruder, carrying impure genes and a flawed human mind, yet I had just triggered a cellular-level reaction in a sacred being like Zira. To them, it was an insult to evolution. A defilement of purification. A betrayal of the divine. The mortal has contaminated the core matrix. Vol's voice, the high priest's, rang out like a frozen blade cutting through the mind. He did not shout. He pronounced. With over 4,000 biological cycles etched into his form, Vor no longer needed emotion. Every word he spoke transmitted through the neural collective as a decree. Instantly, the temple's sentinels advanced. Not by footsteps, but with smooth, fluid motions, like dense liquid. They did not walk with muscles. They flowed, like Veltharin's own living architecture had awakened to engulf an anomaly. I was bound, not by chains, but by living enzymes. They read my heartbeat, and the more I panicked, the tighter they constricted. Nearly invisible threads wound around my chest, wrists, ankles, even my tongue, suppressing every sensation until my breath fragmented into shallow, gasping pools. I had never felt closer to death, not because of a weapon, but because life itself was crushing me. A biological control system so perfect it became merciless. Zira still stood there. At the core of the neural circle, where all energy was meant to converge in preparation for her union with the genetic sovereign. In just a few hours, the ritual of divine confluence would have completed, and she would have become the womb for Veltharin's next ruling bloodline. She was born not to love, but to receive. Not to choose, but to be chosen. But now, because of one glance, one enzyme deviation, she had shattered their sacred cycle. What this civilization had long defined as a perfection had cracked. "We created you from the highest grade cells," Vor declared, each syllable sinking like a dagger into the trembling foundation. "You were trained to breathe only for the sovereign. To pulse only in harmony with his rhythm. And now, you choose a creature that doesn't even carry Veltharin enzyme." She didn't answer. She walked. With every step she took, the bioarchitecture beneath her recoiled, like the planet itself convulsing at her heresy. But she did not stop. She moved straight toward me, still suspended midair in a net of living tissue, helpless. She stepped barefoot onto the floor, and I watched as her heel touched down, enzyme receptors in her skin sinking with the surface. Light ripples spread beneath her, blinking like a heartbeat. Something was communicating, not with words, but with presence. "I didn't choose," she said, her voice so calm it was terrifying. My body responded to him. My heart beat out of sync with the system. "You can break it, but you can't reverse it." The council fell silent. Then Vor screamed, no longer calm. "The sovereign will destroy us. Our species will collapse. You've traded the sacred for the primal instincts of a lower being." I couldn't hear the rest. A wave of neural interference drowned my senses, images warping, voices becoming wordless echoes, colors shattering into chaos. I thought I was dying. But then, she touched me. Not to save, but to connect. Just one fingertip brushing my skin, and it felt like the entire universe detonated behind my sternum. An indescribable rush. Like electricity flooding nerves I never knew I had. Like every fear, every ache, every longing I buried was pulled into a single point where she was staring at me. And the world broke. Not in destruction, but in reconstruction. I didn't fall down. I fell inward. Into a field of soft light, where there were no bodies, no names, no genders. Only raw data, pure feeling, fragments of memory pouring into my mind like a river of truth. I saw her, Zira, from when she was still a programmable embryo, immersed in holy hormone baths for years, emotions surgically muted and purged from her DNA stream. I saw her gaze at the stars once and wonder, if I never get to choose, am I still a living being? I also saw the sovereign. No form. No soul. A block of absolute enzyme, so flawless it was inhuman. A construct built to eliminate deviation and reproduce a bloodline through sheer indifference. And I understood, Zira feared it. She did not want to dissolve into something she could never love. Alarms blared across the planet. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, not suspended anymore, but the enzyme tendrils still clung to my limbs. Above, thousands of sensors pivoted in unison, red lights flashing like a bio-nightmare. From the central biotransmission node, a decree echoed in synthetic perfection. Enzyme extinction protocol initiated. Xenomate X9 will be deconstructed for restandardization. Accompanying human specimen will be dissected for anomalous gene mapping. I grabbed her hand. I didn't know where the strength came from, but I stood. I didn't hesitate. Run, I said. Not shouted. Commanded. The way a man commands when the woman he loves is worth dying for. She looked at me. No longer with the gaze of a bioengineered creation, but with the eyes of a real woman. A woman who was now deciding whether to betray her entire species for something that had never been programmed. If we leave, the Enclave will hunt us to the edges of the galaxy. They'll never let us live. I squeezed her hand. Then we won't live. We'll exist. And so we ran. Not because we feared death, but because, for the first time, we had tasted what it meant to be alive. Behind us, neural gates cracked open layer by layer, guards flooding out like enzyme-bred hunters. Scout ships blinked to life in orbit, tuning themselves to Zira's heartbeat. Every breath she took was a signal. Every step I made was a test of human instinct, flee or fight. On a planet screaming in anguish. In a universe that never welcomed those who chose the wrong species. We chose each other. Kayla 9 had nothing worth living for. No oceans. No forests. No native life forms. Just stone and jagged ridges that jutted upward like the spine of some long-buried ancient beast. But it had oxygen, just enough warmth to prevent cellular decay, and most importantly, it had no biological signals, no enzyme tracking systems from Veltharin. A dead zone to them. A sanctuary to us. We took shelter in a half-domed cavern tucked beneath the northern cliffs. Bioluminescent crystals coated the interior walls, glowing softly with their own rhythmic cycles, not the harsh glare of fluorescent light, but a warm, dusky pink, gentle as sunlight bleeding through mist during an Earth sunset I could barely recall. Every time Zira lay beside me, turned toward me, that glow would catch in her silver eyes and I'd swear the universe itself was folding inward into two infinite wells. And in that moment, I knew there was no other world more worth living on than the one where she was. Food was just emergency nutrient tubes drawn from the biological compartments of the armor she'd escaped with. It was tasteless, an artificial blend of proteins and reconstructed enzymes, as flavorless as everything she'd been forced to ingest her whole life. But every time I pressed one gently, letting drops fall onto her lips, Zira no longer looked at me with the blank gaze of a xenomate. She ate because she needed to, but she looked at me like, for the first time, existing wasn't just a genetic directive. One night, she finally asked, "Why did you touch me that day?" Her voice no longer carried the cold edge of biological programming. It softened, slowed, like she was learning how to shape sound with her throat instead of transmitting sterile data. I smiled, never breaking my gaze from her softly glowing skin, the kind of light that could drive anyone mad with desire. But I didn't see her as a symbol of reproduction. I saw someone reborn from the ashes of a dying civilization. "I didn't touch you," I said. "You came close to me." She didn't reply. But that night, she didn't sleep 2 meters away like before. She came closer, close enough for me to hear the faint, living hum of enzymes moving under her skin. Zira's body wasn't like anything ever designed. It didn't just respond to temperature or biological waveforms anymore. It responded to emotion. Tiny enzyme threads shimmered invisibly from her skin, but when they touched me, it was like molten silk crawling down my spine, a shiver that started at the back of my neck and rippled all the way to my heels. We didn't do anything. We just lay next to each other. But the air between our bodies felt thick enough to crush lungs. Not from fear, but from a craving neither of us had been taught to name. A biological need that didn't come from programming, but from pure, shared perception. I remember that night clearly. There were no words. Only breathing. And then, in that silent stretched taut between two species, she kissed me. It wasn't like any kiss I remembered. Her lips were soft, not from flesh alone, but from a layer of adaptive enzyme tissue. The moment they touched mine, they began sinking, adjusting to my temperature, my pH level, the structure of my skin, like they were learning, adapting, resonating. I didn't react with reason. I simply placed my hand on her back, gently tracing along the base of her wings, wings not built for flight, but for dispersing pheromones. When I reached the joint where muscle and nerve met emission glands, her entire body trembled, like a microbiological wave had just surged out from her central neural system. I could feel enzyme filaments from her wings threading beneath my skin, crawling up my spine, and I knew, one more moment, and she would no longer be Xenomate. "If you don't stop," she whispered, breath shallow, "I will stop being Xenomate." I looked at her. I didn't smile. I didn't see anything wrong in what she said. I simply whispered, "I don't want you to be Xenomate. I want you to be Zira." And so, we made love. No rituals. No divine overseers. No sacred enzyme codes. No purity protocols. Just two beings, once defined by their genetic roles and biological duties, now breaking every boundary to experience the most primal connection. Touching, holding, merging. She placed her hand on my chest, feeling my heartbeat racing beyond reason. But she wasn't afraid. She pressed her lips to my neck, trailing sensor-rich enzymes along my veins. She learned me through each breath, each clenched hand, every vibration I couldn't even name, sensations never recorded in Veltharin's biological dictionaries. My body wasn't perfect. I had scars. Ragged breaths, human growls and primal reactions. And somehow, that only made her cling tighter, not as a vessel seeking fusion, but as a woman finally realizing she was alive. We don't know how long we were together. We just know that when it was over, we lay entangled, our sweat, or whatever passed for it, mingled across the cold stone beneath us. Neither of us spoke. Because we didn't need to. Her eyes were closed, her head resting on my chest, arms wrapped around my waist like I might disappear if she let go. For the first time in her life, she wasn't programmed to do that. She chose it. And I knew a new ritual had been born. Not by gods, but by two beings who were never supposed to touch. 3 weeks passed on Kayla 9 as if time no longer belonged to clocks or suns. We didn't count by days or hours, but by heartbeats. By the way her skin pressed against my chest. By how my body trembled each time the enzymes beneath her skin shifted hue, a biological reaction system I had never known could exist. Every morning, I woke not to alarms, but to the quiet rhythm of her heart beating against me, and not the sterile, calculated pulse of a divine machine, but something alive. Every night, we slept beside each other, no longer separated by species, only by warmth, skin, touch, and the fragile belief that we were living something that had never been named. But then, her body began to change. It wasn't sudden. It came in fragments. Slowly. The enzyme streams in her blood began to restructure. I saw it, how the glow of her skin became uneven, soft pulses of light trailing down from her collarbone to her lower abdomen like gentle flashes of living lightning. That light didn't follow Veltharin's biological patterns. It wasn't stable. It wasn't cyclical. It was learning. One night, I woke to find her curled in on herself, one hand clutching her stomach, sweat, or something like it, soaking through her biological armor. "I can't decode this," she said, her eyes fixed on her belly. Her voice wasn't panicked, but I felt a deep, foreign confusion, one that her species' collective neural systems had never taught her how to manage. I sat beside her, reaching out to place a hand on her shoulder, but she didn't react as she normally would. Instead, she took my hand, placed it directly over her stomach. Her skin was warmer than usual, not from heat, but because something inside was moving. "My secondary reproductive system, it isn't reacting properly to divine enzyme structure," she whispered, her gaze distant. "It's responding to human genes." "To you." I said nothing. I didn't know what to say. All I could feel was this: her body was holding something new, something alive, something so fundamentally different that no language yet created could describe it. A life form, born not from sacred rites, but from union outside any law. A being that fit no biological model ever encoded. She paused, as though the next word might be a sin, "is not human." I swallowed hard, waiting. "It's not Veltharin either." We called it Echo. Not because it mirrored anyone, but because it was the first ripple from a future that had never been written. When I placed my hand over her womb, I felt pulses, not like a heartbeat, but like waves of raw biology washing into my nervous system, sending dizzying signals back through my spine as though it had tapped directly into the core of my being. Echo didn't kick. It pulsed. No thumping. No movement. No ultrasounds. Just enzyme-based pulses, radiating outward from within her body, as if scanning the world around it, registering, learning, and transmitting. We didn't know that only hours later, those enzyme pulses would ripple across light years. No satellites. No devices. Echo itself was a living transmitter, primitive, ancient, and beyond any standard measure. And the signal was received. Not by humans. Not by any nearby planet, but by the Council of Biospheres beyond time, a coalition of ancient species that existed beyond normal temporal flow, where every Veltharin mating ritual had once been observed and codified. And now, their systems had picked up something anomalous, an enzyme outlier, a cycle that defied their models, unmatched by any genomic file on record. A life form that had never existed. And in their world, that was something unacceptable. Zira sat beside me, eyes closed, though I knew she wasn't asleep. Her belly gave off a faint glow. Not red. Not blue. But a soft metallic hue, strange and steady. I rested my head on her lap, feeling the quiet movements beneath her skin press into my forehead. And I realized, from this moment on, we were no longer fugitives. We were a beacon. We carried a life the galaxy would not welcome. Not because it was dangerous, but because it had never existed before. And I whispered to her belly, to Echo, using words from no language that had ever been named. "You will not belong to any one species. But you will have a heart. And that heart will know how to love, the way I loved your mother." I remember the first morning when the silence of Kayla 9 was broken. The ground didn't quake. There were no engines, no metallic fragments tearing through the atmosphere. But I knew. They had come. And they didn't knock. They didn't invade. Because to them, Zira was not a rebel. She was a malfunction, and their mission was to restore. To reset her genes. To erase everything that didn't align with their predetermined model. In Veltharin's system, there is no concept of choosing wrong. Only of deviating. And anything that deviates must be purged. The voice came, not from the sky, not from speakers, but from inside our heads, all at once. It entered our nervous systems, touching the reflex control nexus directly, like a thought knocking straight against the spine. Xenomate X9. Your biological form has deviated. Genetic structure is mutating beyond model bounds. Surrender for recovery. I turned to Zira. She said nothing. Just held my hand. That small hand, each finger glowing faintly now, enzymes beneath her skin beginning to stir, as if preparing for a biological counter-response. If they capture me, she said, not looking at me, they'll break me down gene by gene to erase your trace from my body. I was afraid. Not for myself. For her. And for what was growing inside her, a life the world had never been willing to accept. No one touches you now. No one, I said. As if it were a vow. We activated the enzyme defense mesh from her living armor, the same one she once wore for sacred rituals. But now, it no longer functioned as before. Her body had changed. Her genetic foundation had recombined under human influence. The armor, once tuned to divine gene rhythms, now had to readapt to human enzyme signals. The result was a defense system, unstable at best. In orbit, 3 enzyme-hunting satellites appeared, spherical, silent, without engines or weapons, but each carried a semi-biological neural core capable of restructuring her body remotely using gene erasure waves. If they initiated the enzyme destandardization signal, her body wouldn't explode. It would dissolve, molecule by molecule, gene by gene, every contaminated sequence unknotted until nothing remained but a dull, nameless biofluid. They didn't need to kill her with force. Only to restore the original. I couldn't let that happen. I looked at her. And this time, I didn't just see an alien. Or the woman I loved. I saw some other. She placed her hand gently on her belly. The glow of her enzymes was faint but steady. Echo, the unborn child, no name, no species, no entry in any galactic genome file. But it was alive. And it was sending signals. It wasn't afraid. But we were afraid for it. I adjusted the armor's defense configuration, rerouting enzyme barriers to prioritize her vital organs, not for counterattack, but for survival. Every second, Veltharin's systems were tracking her signals, logging the deviations, preparing for their final decision, eliminate. We can't run, she said, eyes still fixed on the horizon. She was right. With 3 satellites, any biological engine would be blinded within seconds. Any irregular enzyme trail would be pinpointed instantly. Quietly, I asked, then what can we do? She was silent for a long moment. Then, placing both hands on her stomach, she closed her eyes. We can't run. But Echo might. I stepped back slightly. What are you saying? My body holds a reserve enzyme gland, meant to expel the embryo if incompatibility is detected. It was only supposed to activate if my union with the Sovereign failed. But now, I can use it to launch Echo from me. Suspend its biosystem. Seal it inside an independent enzyme pod. I went cold. Colder than any dead planet I'd ever landed on. No. No. If you do that, you'll die. She looked at me. For the first time, her silver eyes faded to smoke gray. Like she had shed the role of sacred mate. And become a mother. If I die, but Echo lives, it's worth it. I shouted, clutching her hand tighter. We are not doing it that way. No sacrifices. No hollow victory that costs us everything. She stared at me for a long time. So long. And then the system's voice returned, colder than metal. Xenomate X9. Reformatting no longer viable. Verdict, destandardization. Preparing tissue-level reprocessing. They had begun. The enzyme mesh shivered, not from electricity, but from atmospheric compression. A distant enzyme pressure wave was building. I felt it in my ears, my pulse. And Zira, she began to tremble. Not from fear, but because Echo was reacting. The child glowed brighter. From within her, enzyme tendrils burst like light, spreading through her muscles, linking with the armor, then spilling into the ground, and I saw something I'd never imagined. Her body was restructuring the planetary defense grid. Echo, still unborn, was controlling enzymes. Not like humans control machines. Not like Veltharin controls biology. But in a new way, emotion-driven reaction. I heard her voice, not aloud, maybe not even external, but deep within me, it won't let me die. And for the first time in Veltharin's biological history, an unborn life form issued a countersignal to cancel destandardization, generating an enzyme-neutral zone around its mother, forcing the satellites to retreat 3 orbital units to avoid complete systems loss. We stood there, in the eye of an enzyme storm forming around us. I held Zira's hand. Not out of fear, but because this time we weren't running. They would have to learn how to step back. In the face of a life that refused to be classified. I never thought of myself as a hero. I carried no weapons, wore no combat armor, had no artificial intelligence guiding me. I was just a human, born on the third rock from an average star, raised in the noise of cities and the loneliness of sleeping in deep, cold space. But that never stopped me from loving. Never stopped me from believing. And certainly never stopped me from resisting. They had everything: flawless biotech, enzyme control systems that spanned time itself, a civilization that fine-tuned its genetics down to each generation. But there was one thing they could never possess: will unbound by code. When Zira collapsed beside me, forcing her body to shield Echo, our unborn child, from the destandardization waves of Veltharin satellites, I realized something important: only I was chaotic enough to break their system. Because I wasn't designed to obey. I was born to err. And that made me free. I returned to the auxiliary chamber of her bio-armor, where a microfragment of enzyme command core still remained. It was meant as an emergency link to the mothership, to request recalibration in extreme cases. But I didn't use it to request. I used it to infiltrate. The control core of Veltharin wasn't mechanical. It was a living biological network, a chain of enzyme neurons constantly updated by emotional feedback from the genomate system. That meant Zira's feelings, every glance, every tremor, had been encoded and sent upstream. And I knew, somewhere in their archives, there had been one abnormal signal, her first reaction when she saw me. I traced it. Retrieved it from a small drop of blood still left on the blade of the enzyme knife I had used to cut my hand while saving her last week. It wasn't much, just a few drops. But enough. The enzyme in my blood, though foreign, was the first trigger that caused Zira's genetic divergence. And that was the key. I slipped into the subbiological layer beneath the central sanctum, where my armor had once synced to monitor her heartbeat after our union. There, I found an old transmission node, an outdated bioconnection port, unused for over 2,000 cycles. Their greatest vulnerability lay in their greatest arrogance, believing perfection needed no backup. I injected my blood into the enzyme core. No keyboard. No encryption. Just a biological reaction. But I saw it, an immediate tremor in the planet's bionetwork. The enzyme columns around us changed color. No longer the pale silver of Veltharin. Now it was the deep, human red of blood. I had done it. I had redefined the concept of God in their system. For millions of years, they believed divinity to be the purest enzyme construct, a stable gene pattern, perfectly aligned, devoid of error. Eternity written in sterile genetic code. But now, the very lifeline of their control system, the enzyme core that governed all biological signals around the planet, reacted to an anomaly, my blood. And the system chose to yield. Because enzymes don't have loyalty. They only respond to the strongest signal. And the one from my blood, the one that made Zira first reach out, first kneel, first defy everything she was programmed for, was the strongest they had ever recorded. Echo didn't need to react. Echo just needed to exist. And it did. Echo sent out a pulse. Not a destructive one, but a soft wave. A whisper of new life rising from Zira's womb into the air, rippling through Kayla 9's thin atmosphere and transmitting directly to the mothership's bioarray. It wasn't image, logic, or enzyme pattern. It was emotive memory. The things Echo had absorbed from me and Zira, the first touch, the embrace in a cold night, the trembling after our union, encoded and broadcast not as a plea, but as testimony. Proof that it was alive. Proof that it could love. Proof that it didn't need to be renamed to be accepted. I stood at the center of a growing bio-shockwave. Everything around us changed color, the defense grids, the enzyme hunting satellites, the gene amplification gates, all syncing one by one to a new signal. A signal not written by code, but born from a human, an alien, and a life form that belonged to no species. We didn't need to fight. We only needed to exist. And all their laws began to collapse. When the final message echoed from Veltharin's central neural net, I heard a command that had never been uttered in all of their recorded cycles. Recalibration failed. New enzyme pattern cannot be overridden. Sole remaining option, submission. And so they knelt. Not on their knees, but through signal. The biosatellites reoriented. The enzyme streams retracted, recalibrated. Their entire biological control network, once stretching across 32 star systems, now obeyed a life form that had not even been born. Echo. Because Echo proved something that could never be programmed. Love can create something stronger than every genetic system ever designed. And the first to place a hand over its heart was me, a human. When Echo's signal rippled across every enzyme stratum and was recorded as unclassifiable, silence blanketed the entire biological system surrounding Kayla 9. It was not the silence of anticipation. It was the stillness of acknowledgement. Because, for the first time in Veltharin's history, a life form born outside any known civilization was not destroyed. The mothership, once a godlike presence orbiting high above, ceased its termination broadcasts. Instead, an emergency biochannel opened. A voice reached straight into the gray matter of my brain, and I knew this wasn't a threat. We have not come to kill. We have come to learn. What she has created is an unprecedented leap forward. I looked at Zira, sitting beside me, holding her belly. She wasn't bracing to fight. She wasn't releasing defense enzymes. She was simply a mother, soothing her unborn child, and waiting for the world to adjust itself. I brushed a hand through her glowing silver hair. I wasn't sure if it shimmered from enzymes or from Echo. But when she laid her head on my chest, I heard her long, soft exhale, like a breeze passing through a world already too old. They won't leave us alone. I gripped her hand tighter and whispered a truth that had already proven itself. Then let them learn to love instead of programming it. 3 days later, Kayla 9 was no longer barren. A new biosanctum had emerged, not constructed by tools, but grown by enzymes responding to Zira's own life rhythms. It looked nothing like the temples of old Veltharin. No pillars. No domes. No divine symbols. Just a living structure, soft, warm, pulsing gently in tune with Echo. And then they came. Not just Veltharin, but civilizations that had long rejected emotion. Species from star systems ruled solely by biological logic. Ancient races who had always reproduced through gene encoding without feeling. Councils that had surgically separated love from reproduction. All of them sent representatives. Not to retrieve Zira. Not to extract Echo's genome. But to ask, to beg, to understand. They arrived in vessels larger than anything I'd ever seen. They didn't land. They hovered, low, careful, as if not to disturb the soil that had absorbed her sweat. And from them, ambassadors descended. Some had faintly biological forms. Others were vibrating crystalline structures. A few had no bodies at all, just cognitive fields, shimmering thought. But all of them knelt. not on knees, but in signal. By shutting off all their data recorders. By disabling enzyme cloning protocols. By laying their consciousness bare for the first time in millions of years, not to control, but to listen. And what they came to hear wasn't data. It was a story. The story of a divine female, engineered to be nothing more than a genetic tool, but who chose to love a man without divine blood. The story of a human, carrying no power, no superior genome, but who became the first thing a sacred being ever defied her programming for. The story of a child whose cellular makeup couldn't be catalogued by any system, yet represented the only future capable of uniting civilizations through feeling, not formulas. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. I simply held Zira's hand and walked with her into the light of 1,000 biosignals converging on us. Their eyes did not seek enzymes. They did not scan temperatures. They didn't measure hormone flux. They only watched the faint glow in her belly, where Echo was growing. Without command codes. Without permission. Only with a mother's love. And a father's protection. No one proposed motions. No one raised objections. Because for the first time, there was nothing to debate. Only a life that could never be programmed, yet everyone wanted to touch. And so we remained on Caleb 9. No longer fleeing. No longer hunted. No longer heretics. But living proof of a simple truth: love is the highest form of evolution, one no genetic system can replicate. And the child born from that love is the future.